beautiful bind-off edge was done using the tubular bind-off method, and it is my absolute favorite method for binding off using a 1x1 rib. I'm Kristen TenDyke. Let me show you how to do this. Before beginning with bind-off, you'll want to cut a length of yarn about 3 times the length of your bind-off. And I like to do that by spreading out the width of my fabric completely and making the loops of yarn actually cover the width of the fabric about 3 times. So I make 3 long loops of yarn that match the width of in this case it's the body of a sweater. And then cut the yarn and thread it onto a tapestry needle. This is a sewn bind-off. It has 5 steps and it is time consuming, but it is so worth the effort. If your 1x1 ribbing begins with a knit stitch, you would begin on step 1, which to do that, you insert your tapestry needle knitwise through the first stitch on your left needle, and you can slide that stitch completely off and pull your yarn through just a little ways. You don't need to pull the whole tail through after step 1. For step 2, you're going to skip this purl stitch because steps 1 and 2 only work with the knit stitches. For step 2, we'll go through the second stitch purlwise, but we're going to leave this one on. And we are going to pull, oops, make sure it doesn't hop over the needle like that. And you want to pull the entire tail through your work after step 2. And you can make it nice and snug. So for steps 3, 4, and 5, we work only with the purl stitches. So our first stitch is a purl stitch, and we're going to insert the needle into it purlwise and slide that off. You can pull this through just a little ways. We don't need to pull it all the way through yet. And then step 2 is from the back of the work. You separate the first 2 stitches and slide your needle between them. And again, you don't need to pull all the way through. Just give it a little bit of space, a little bit of yarn so you have some space to work. And for step 3, we go into the next purl stitch. So we skip that knit stitch. This purl stitch knitwise. So from the bottom. So you can between, when you're coming through the back, you want to make sure you're into the middle of the stitch and go all the way through to the back of the needle. You can pull your tail all the way through. So those are the first 5 steps, and so those are the 5 steps for the tubular bind-off. Steps 1 and 2 are knit stitches, knitwise and off, and then purlwise and on. And pull all the way through. And if you're beginning with a purl stitch in your 1x1 rib, start at the very beginning with step 3, which is insert purlwise, slide it off, and then step 4 is go between the 2 stitches on the needle and through the second stitch knitwise all the way to the back of the needle and pull it all the way through. This is a time-consuming process, but there's a way, once you get the hang of these 5 steps, there's a way to make it go a little bit faster. I like to turn it into 2 steps. So I combine steps 1 and 2 into almost 1 step. See, they're both on the needle, and I can just pull the yarn through after I do those 2 steps. And then steps 3, 4, and 5 I also turn into 1 step. So purl, slide off, and then can poke that needle tip through between the first 2 stitches, pick up and go behind the second stitch. So let me do that again for you. You go between the first 2 and into the second stitch knitwise, pulling the front strand to the it seems like you're pulling it through to the back, but you're really putting the needle into the stitch and pulling it out the back. And then you can pull that tail all the way through. So start with steps 1 through 5 and practice those until you really get the hang of what you're doing before you try to combine them into a more simplified version. So step 1 is in through the front of the first stitch, slide it off. Step 2 is to go purlwise into the second stitch. Pull your yarn all the way through. And then step 3 is purlwise into the first purl stitch and slide it off. Step 4 is to go between the two front needle, Step 4 is to go between the first 2 stitches on the left needle. And step 5 is to go knitwise into the second stitch and through. Then you can pull that all the way through. Takes a little practice, but you'll get the hang of it. And then when you get to the very end, you'll have this beautiful stretchy bind off where these knit stitches just kind of roll right over the edge. If you look at your ready-to-wear sweaters that you have purchased in the store, the edges of the ribbing will look. So this gives it a professional look. It's really well worth the time. So if you've enjoyed this tutorial, like this video, subscribe to my channel, and